Dr. Stamps, are you ready?
Ready. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the American Nephrology Nurses Association's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Healthcare series. It is a pleasure to welcome you all tonight for our discussion on Understanding Racism, Module 4. With me this evening is Dr. Ebony Caldwell. Oh, well, I guess I should introduce myself because some of you may not know me. I am Debbie Stamps. I am a registered nurse and the consultant for diversity, equity, inclusion at the American Nurses Nephrology Association. And with me tonight is my amazing colleague, Dr. Ebony Caldwell. Dr. Caldwell is currently the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Belonging, and Justice at Rochester Regional Health. And she is here with us in her consulting role, where she's going to lead us in our discussion and education this evening. She comes with a few years of experience, not only in healthcare, but also at a state level of implementing strategic initiatives around diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is my pleasure to transition over to her to have tonight's session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stamps. Thank you. Glad to be here with you all this evening. Thank you for joining us for Module 4. Hopefully you have learned something from Modules 1 through 3, and we're going to continue our building our awareness and building our toolbox as we move into Module 4. The objectives are the same, so we're looking to level set and define common language to promote DEI initiatives, discuss bias and racism, and understand the impact on healthcare, identify concepts and strategies to mitigate and eradicate disparities, and then develop our toolbox for leaders to address bias so that we can have a culture of allyship. Tonight, we're going to talk about the social construct of race, the definitive continuum, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. We're going to talk a little bit about discrimination, cultural norms, and levels of racism. And then we're going to wrap up and give you some time for question and answer. So we're going to start with the social construct of race. And the social construct of race is a psychological concept that assigns categories to demographic groups by physical characteristics rather than biological facts. It's hierarchical in purpose, and often is used as a way to justify, create, or perpetuate racism. Subconscious or consciously, we buy into these concepts every day. If we think about examples like when we say blacklisted, that means someone has been put on a list and they are not to be touched. But then if we think about the opposite, there might be, sometimes we hear the example of white lie. It's just not so bad, right? So looking at things through that hierarchical purpose or prism is how racism is perpetuated. Here's an example on the screen as well. When we think about a social construct of race, the example of Italians as whites has been demonstrated how Italians were not seen as white people in the early colonial days. And this is in Australia, but it was also in the US as well. And as a result, they faced increased discrimination. Over time, Italian Americans or Italian Australians assimilated, and influx of darker skinned migrants arrived, and Italians slowly became included, right? So there's that group, there's that concept of us versus them. And so if we can group things together, it makes it easier for one group to advance and have a hierarchy over another. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about this social construct of race as we move through the material tonight. We also want to talk about the definitive continuum, and that is when we look at the three terms on the screen: prejudice, discrimination, and racism. A lot of times this information or these terms are used synonymously, but they are different, and it is a continuum that we need to be aware of. Prejudice are just ideas and beliefs about groups cultures that we absorb from the world around us. But when we put action to those ideas and beliefs, we move into the territory of discrimination. And we know that those are individual actions based on prejudices, and they can be based on race, age, religion, health, gender, and so many other criteria, and they take the form of unfair practices. And then if we're not able to interrupt our ideas or our actions, we move into that territory of racism. And we have that ability to systematically and adversely impact the lives of entire groups. And so this reminds me of that Gandhi quote where if we don't watch our thoughts, they become our words, then our words become our actions become our habits, and so on. I like to make sure that I'm always including the ANNA glossary terms here. And so for discrimination in your glossary, it's about actions and behaviors again. It's based on conscious and unconscious prejudice, which is in favor of one group over another, and which provides provisions for group goods, services, or opportunities. And discriminatory behaviors range from slights to hate crimes. And this is how it's defined in your ANA glossary. I want to talk a little bit about discrimination and how it plays out in in-group and out-group discrimination. When we think of in-groups, they can be formed on a wide range of attributes, including gender, race, ethnicity, age, maybe even your neighborhood, geographic location or region, your religion, your nationality, or even sports team, just to name a few. And then individuals are members of our group. They're favored, while those of an outside group are not. This is referred to as in or out group discrimination. And according to William Sumner, each group nourishes its own pride and vanity, boasts its superiority, and it exists in its own definities and looks with contempt on the outsiders. And so if we think of an in group, they hold the generic social norm. Whatever we think norm is, that group represents it. They are the standard of the social identity, what everyone should aspire to be. The benefits, they have benefit of options and choices, and they have a distinction within the group. Well, if we look at out group, it is outsiders or people who are less than the norm. We think about society, social identity that is substandard. Their options are limited, and then they have no distinction when we think about the opposite group. So some examples that I think will resonate with us is the class divide. And so we have the have and the have-nots. One is an in group, one is an out. We also have cultural conflicts. And so depending on the hierarchy or depending on where you are located or depending on your region, we can see the differences in the in or out groups when we think about cultural conflicts. And then we also have maybe veterans or civilians. We think very differently if someone has that veteran status among the veterans, right? And they see the world or they see things very differently than civilians or perform very different or have different behaviors and actions. And then finally, one that is familiar to all of us and very top of mind, our political affiliations. There's an in group and an out group depending on which group you sit in. And so those are in-group, out-group discrimination that we need to be aware of and try to do our best to think outside of our group and try to be most inclusive, be more inclusive whenever possible. Cultural norms. And so I picked this because groups or in-groups and out-groups depending on, they depend on society, and as society evolves or sometimes the pendulum swings, society thinks about morals and beliefs and customs very differently. And so when we think about that social construct, it really is formed by what we think and how we categorize people, actions, and behaviors. And so when we look at culture, culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, arts, morals, laws, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by a member of society. And so looking at different norms, when we think about folk ways or folklore, or maybe you would call it traditional customs, we think about things being right versus rude. When we think about things in terms of mores and acceptable social rules, we think about things in terms of right versus wrong. Another cultural norm or norm might be taboos, goes against social or religious customs, and so it might be thought of as right versus forbidden. And then finally, we come down to laws, system of rules and regulations recognized and enforced by a society. And we think of those in terms of right versus illegal. So continuing to think a little bit about laws, they also change with society and how our culture sees norms. And so when we think about legal versus right, at one time slavery was legal, but was it right? Um, Also true of prohibition. At one time it was illegal, but now it's legal. So does that mean that it's right? Right? Um, Another way to look at it is Jim Crow laws, separate but equal. It was legal at one time, but do we think it was right? And then finally, the legalization of marijuana. Very recently illegal, but now it's legal. So do we think it's right? And when we think about these cultural norms, it makes this quote by Abraham Lincoln really resonates with me. You must remember that some things legally right are not morally right. And so morals are subjective. People have different morals. We come from different backgrounds, different experiences. And so as society shifts, our legal lens and our laws shift as well. But our morals, we should be true to our morals and thinking about how we can um, align the two. Okay, this is dominant culture, a list of things that came from a key resource that we rely on when we think about anti-racism work by Tima Uku. She describes how behaviors that are associated with the dominant culture or traditions and values come to be seen as the norm and are preferred. And so there's a whole host of behaviors and values here. One of them is perfectionism, where we must be perfect in everything we do, or the sense of urgency, deadline, and we're rushing and we're on a hamster wheel when we're thinking about corporate America or even in healthcare. We're on a timeline. We want to see more patients and we want to get them through so that we can, uh, one, charge the insurance, and another is to see as many patients as possible in a day, right? And so that sense of urgency. Another thing is worship of written word, where we have to have everything written down. If it's not written down, I say this a lot myself, I could buy stock and post it. Like I write down everything. If I didn't write it down or if it's not written down, it didn't happen. I say that to myself. But that's something that the dominant culture sees as a norm and is preferred. Also, power hoarding. You try to get as much power as you can, right? It's all about the American dream. We want to make sure that we're advancing and we have some kind of legacy to leave behind. And a lot of times that's about power. Not always, but a lot of times it is. And so this whole list of things, I don't know if you can see them as the culture that we live in, but a lot of them resonate with me. We're individualism. We want to do our own thing. We're not as communal as we used to be. Or the right to comfort. I don't have to talk about or be involved in things that make me uncomfortable. So these are the way the dominant culture lives, but I want to challenge that and maybe we can think about things differently. The dominant culture versus something else. When we think about perfectionism, maybe there's a way to look at being more appreciative, right? And we don't have to be perfect, but we appreciate people for what they bring to the table. Another one is sense of urgency. Maybe we can hold space for what's important and have flexibility for the unexpected. We want to get through an agenda in a meeting and we have to move quickly because we only have 20, 30 minutes to an hour. But maybe something will come up in the meeting where we need to hold space and go beyond that hour, or we don't finish the agenda. Um, Another one is worship of written word. Um, and another way to look at that is maybe all forms of communication are valued. When we think about the Indians or even the hieroglyphics that we found in caves, when we think about history, there were people wrote in symbols. They didn't always write in words. People tell stories to pass down their traditions. And so is that not valued in this dominant culture? A different way of communicating rather than just being written down in black and white. So thinking about how we can value all forms of communication. And then the last one is power hoarding. How can we share power, especially when we think about what the topic that we're talking about tonight, racism. It comes from the groups or the cultures that have power. How can we share that and be an ally to one another so that we're equally distributing resources and power so that everyone can have their level of success and move forward in a culture where we're all finding life, liberty, and happiness. So, what is racism? Again, I like to go back to the ANNA glossary, and your definition here is assaults on the human spirit in the form of actions that perpetuate systemic injustices and inequalities. And so I found this independent campaign and it really resonated with me where it says racism stops with me, right? The work, and I think we've said this many times before, starts with self-reflection. We have to do the work within ourselves to see where we are on this DEI journey, and then we can begin to look outward. So racism starts with me realizing that it is about humanity, it is about our actions, and it is about a system of inequities and what can we do to turn this around. And it reminds me of that example in the Caste book, the caste system about the house and having a good foundation. You may buy a house that was built 20, 30 years before you lived in it, and you don't say, oh, the roof is bad, but I didn't do it. You are now living in the house, and so you need to fix the roof, right? The other part of it, I think about maybe the roof is bad, but it's only leaking in 2 rooms, and the other 3 rooms are just fine. So I'm staying dry, but maybe my brother or my sister is not staying dry. We want to make sure that everyone has a roof on their dwelling that keeps them safe, that keeps them dry, that keeps them protected, right? And so it's our job to collectively work on this house, whether we built it or not, we are all living in it. And so we need to make it work for everyone. And that's the way you kind of see racism as something we all, none of us here living today put the system in place, but we all need to be responsible for working to make it better. This is a analogy that I absolutely love by Dr. Kamara Jones. It's the gardener's tale, and it helps us look at racism through the lens of a gardener. And so I'm going to abbreviate this story, and hopefully I can move through it quickly. So imagine a gardener has 2 flower boxes, one filled with rich and fertile soil and another with poor and rocky soil. 2 packets of seeds. They're both the same, but one is pink and one is red. The gardener prefers red over pink. So she plants, or they plant the red seed in the rich, fertile soil and the pink seed in the rocky, poor soil. Flowers grow and flourish tall and strong. Box of rock, but the box with the rocky soil, things look very different. So the next year, same thing happens. The red flowers grow really tall and vigorous and strong, but the pink flowers in the poor soil struggle to survive. Year after year, the same thing happens. And then the gardener stands back and looks and says, I was right to prefer red over pink. Look how vibrant the beautiful red flowers look and how pitiful and scrawny the pink ones look. And so if we take that tale and kind of look at these three levels of racism, institutional racism is that initial historical separation of the seeds, where the structured factors of the flower boxes and how we kept the soil separate. That is structural barriers or differences in access. And so the pink seeds never really had a chance in the poor rocky soil, but the red seeds survived in the rich, fertile soil, but we don't make that distinction when we're looking at institutional racism. So when we go down and look at personal mediated racism, we're thinking about the gardener's disdain for the pink flowers because they look poor and scrawny. And so the gardener plucks them before they get a chance to grow, not considering that they never had the right soil or the right environment. So that is that personal mediated racism where intentional or unintentional, we're not giving the pink flowers a chance. And then finally, the internalized racism is when a bee comes along to pollinate the flowers and the pink ones tell the bee, stop, don't bring that pollination here. I prefer the red because the pink flowers have now internalized that I'm no good. I need the red pollination in order to make me better. And so I love this story in the way, and I would encourage you to Google Dr. Kamara Jones, The Gardener's Tale, because she tells it so much better than I do. It really is a powerful story to help us better understand the three levels of racism. And so I pose this question here: who is the gardener? The gardener is the one with the power to decide, the power to act, and the control over the resources. And so the gardener decided which flower they like best. The gardener also decided which soil to put each flower in and how to pick and choose who was growing well, who wasn't, and who wasn't going to get a chance. And so we want to keep that in mind when we're thinking about how we support and mitigate racism in our daily lives. So another way to look at the different levels of racism, I won't spend a whole lot of time, but when we think about institutional or structural racism, the preference for red over pink, or the rich versus rocky soil, and then also housing, education, medical care, facilities, that access to those structures is decided by society and by race. When we look at internal or personally mediated racism, not giving the pink flowers support or a chance to fully blossom, it's also police brutality, physician disrespect, or shopkeeper vigilance when you're in a store and somebody might follow you around because of the color of your skin or what you might be wearing, or waiter indifference. I'm sitting at the table, I know I was there first, but then the waiter goes over to serve someone else. And so that's another way to look at interpersonal racism. And then for the last one, internalized racism, avoiding the cross-pollination because the belief that the red is truly better. Look, self-devaluation, or the white man's ice is colder syndrome, where we know that ice is ice. It can't be colder if one person makes it or the other, or the resignation to helplessness and hopelessness. And so different ways to look at the different levels of racism. Race is a social construct with real life implications for racialized and non-racialized groups and is impacting the nursing profession. On January 25th in 2022, the National Commission to Address Racism in Nursing released the results from a survey of over almost 6,000 nurses, with findings showing racism is a substantial problem within the profession. So I pulled a few numbers. Nurses from all groups have reported having a personal experience with racism at work. So 92% of Black nurses have seen this, 69% of Hispanic nurses, 73% of Asian nurses, and 28% of white nurses. And then 56% of nurses say racism in the workplace has negatively impacted their professional well-being. And then finally, Black nurses have experienced racism from leaders, patients, and peers at alarming rates. And that's at the bottom right of your screen. This is part of that independent media campaign that Racism Stops With Me. I thought this pledge was perfect, and it kind of hits on all of the pieces that we need to be thinking about to stop racism. Remove all prejudice from my heart and mind. I pledge to respect the dignity of every individual, regardless of race, and in both word and deed. I pledge to speak up in situations of prejudice, blatant racism, and exploration of any and exploitation of any persons. I pledge to stand in solidarity with victims of hatred and violence. I pledge to acknowledge apartheid from evil system it was, and even though I'm not directly responsible for its legacy, I am responsible for how I respond to it today. And then finally, I pledge to listen and join the dialogue on racial equality with patience and understanding and respect. One last thing I'd like to share is this image that was inspired by the work of Ibram Kendi, who wrote the book How to Be an Anti-Racist. And his philosophy is that it's no longer okay to be racist or not racist. If we are not actively working to interrupt the system, we are part of the problem. And so the opposite of racist isn't not racist, it's anti-racist. And so this diagram, you can read the statements and see where you fall today. Do you fall in the fear zone, learning zone, or growth zone? No matter where you fall today, you have the responsibility and the capacity to be working toward that growth. So Dr. Stamps, I'm going to turn it over to you to see if we have any questions or to facilitate questions.
Thank you so much. I always learn something new. I always appreciate your knowledge and expertise.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any questions?
So I know racism can be a hard topic, but again, there's no blame in this work. None of us set the system up the way it is, but the hope is that we'll all join together to disrupt it. Deb, I think I see some things popping up in the chat.
Yes.
Okay.
First question is from Karen Robbins. Are there any recommendations specifically for ANNA?
Oh, specific recommendation for ANNA to address racism or to?
Yeah, I was just going to ask for a little bit more clarification.
Yeah. So one of the things, Deb, I would say is to go to the website for the National Commission to Address Racism in Nursing. They have a lot of resources there. And you can they have podcasts every week to address different angles of what they are working on. So I think that's a great one. And I think we shared in one of the past, I think it may be for health equity, looking to be an advocate or a mentor or a sponsor for nurses in your discipline, right? I can't tell you how many, I'm not a nurse, but I've been around so many of them. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard nurses eat their young, or just the culture of nursing is not as welcoming as it could be. And you think about it, nursing is also revered as one of the most professions with integrity, right? So we have to kind of align what we say we are, what we say we do, with how we feel and how we treat humanity as a whole. And so doing that work to get involved from every lens, I think, is not just for ANNA, but for all nursing, for the betterment of our communities.
Awesome. And Karen, to your question, as has been presented and discussed, the topic of racism. This is one of the series that we're offering this year, but we are building out our web page, our website, to include resources, and there will be, for each of these education webinars that we've held, there will be a number of resources. And as Dr. Caldwell shared, the American Nurses Association, which the ANNA is an affiliate member of, we have access to all of the podcasts. They just finished the third season of weekly sessions, and those are available. They're all recorded. All the resources are recorded on the website. There's a lot of things we're doing overall at ANNA regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion. However, this is the first discussion and education that we have around racism. I love the house with the leaky roof analogy. We all need to address it.
And so there were some resources that we shared, Dr. Stamps, that will go out to participants after the presentation.
Awesome. Karen, thank you for your support and attending all of the online sessions. And, you know, we do have across the country, there's a lot of work to around anti-DEI. There's legislation. When you think about the states that have pending legislation, and you know, that's a whole nother webinar. But I think what we have to do is continue to share the knowledge and take appropriate action when needed. Because as Dr. Caldwell said, it's about intentionality, right? Knowing what we know and doing what we know for the greater good. Any other questions? I'm looking also in the Q&A. There's nothing in the Q&A. Wonderful. Well, this session has been recorded. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Caldwell, for another very informative webinar. You deliver the information in a way that is very easy to understand, and I truly appreciate your expertise and you spending the time with us this evening. Thank you
so
to
much,
all
Dr.
who.
Stamps.
Thank you. Thank you to all who have attended this session. We hope to see you in the fall for our third session of this year. And please feel free to go out to the ANNA website, and you can view this recording, share it in your chapters, share it with your other colleagues, and also feel free to share the resources. Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a great evening, everyone.